Hello, today I'm going to do a presentation on E. E. Cummings. I want to talk a little bit about his life, and I want to talk a little bit about my favorite poem that I picked from him, and also a little bit of an activity that I want to include with this. But when you think about poetry and poems, you usually think about E. E. Cummings. He's one of the more famous poets out there. He's not something that you probably normally read with younger children, but definitely with your older students or even in college, I'm sure you hear about E. E. Cummings. Um, he was kind of had a different way of being raised and grown up. It was probably typical for the 1860s, but today we wouldn't think of this as being the way we grew up. So he was born in October of 1864. His parents were well known. His father was a pastor and also a professor. He started as a professor at Harvard and then later on moved to a pastor at the Old South Church in Boston. His mother was a stay at home mom, pretty typical for that time period. Even today, we have a lot of stay at home moms, but back in the 1860s, that's typically what they were doing. Um, his mom taught him a lot about reading, writing, and they also taught him about like love to write stuff, especially like poetry, books, short stories, things like that. Um, Before he went to college, he actually went over to World War One. He was an ambulance driver, which I'll talk about that here in a little bit too. But he did go to Harvard once he got back. He received both a bachelor's and a master's. Both are really respective. Um, he had his first poem published while he was at Harvard. It was actually published in a book called The Eight Harvard Poets. It talked about eight different people, obviously him being a part of that, and that was published in 1922. His first book was actually published. It's called The Enormous Room, but we know him more for his poetry, but that was produced in 1924. Um, like I said, he was an ambulance driver um, during World War One, and he was actually arrested as a spy because they thought that he was against France. Um, but he was actually just voicing his concerns about not wanting to be at war. He felt that it was not necessary or needed to happen, but that's where he was. He was also married three different times, and like I said, he had a different way of getting to become famous. He really didn't become famous till the 40s, which, starting in the 20s, getting to the 40s, it seems like a huge gap, which it is. Um, but that's where it happened, and that's where he got started. It was all those new posts during that time with the new time period coming up. He started up being famous in the 40s because they looked at what he was doing, and it actually showed him pretty well that they were on the same path as him. So that's how he became famous, essentially. One of the last things that I found very interesting was one of his poems he released right before he died in 1962. It really made you look at him as what type of person he was. His earlier work was kind of explicit. It was very sexually oriented, um, especially during those time periods. Some of the things he wrote about were pretty out there, should say. But this poem, it kind of connected you and showed you how he lost his father and how he connected and how he was really upset. That really hurt him. But it really said the type of person he was. Um, and like I said, he passed away in 1962. I'm going to read you one of the poems that I really liked. Being a history buff, I really like this one. It's about Buffalo Bill. Everyone knows about him. Came out, shot a bunch of buffalo, hence the name Buffalo Bill. I had to break it down and kind of rearrange this a little bit just to make it fit on here. But this is kind of how it worked. Sometimes you had one line, one word per line, maybe four, maybe five, maybe one, just whatever it is. But here it is. It's called Buffalo Bills. Buffalo Bill's dysfunction, who used to ride a water-smooth silver stallion and break 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. Jesus, he was a handsome man, and what I want to know is, how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death? As you can see, that's a little bit different. Normally, guys, especially during this time period, wouldn't say things like being handsome and all those kind of gestures. You can even see he doesn't use spaces in the words, um, but that's the way he was. One other thing I want to talk about is a little activity I want students to do with this. As you can see, it's a little bit different way to write poetry, but I was thinking that students should find something they really enjoy. I don't care if it's sports or even history like he used. You can use their family. But I want them to write a poem like this. I want at least the subject at the front or at the top, and I want something at the bottom that kind of relates to where that person is or what it's like. So obviously Buffalo Bill had passed away. He used Mr. Death at the end. Use something like that. Write a poem. Doesn't have to be super long. It has to at least be 4 lines. That's what I want the students to do, and that's the activity that I would like them to do. It's not super hard. Don't have to use a lot of words. And a lot of kids, they don't like doing poetry, so it kind of helps them. Um, but that's my thinking. That's my activity I want them to use. I should have wrote a little bit more into this presentation, but that's what I'm going to do. In conclusion, like I said, he was born in 1864 in Massachusetts. His father and mother were well known. His father, like I said, was a professor and a pastor. And so he was already out there to start with. He didn't really become famous until 20 years after he published his first poem. And in the 40s, when all those other new poets were coming up, figured out what he was about, what he was writing about, that's when they really got popular. Um, Still, one thing I want to keep in mind is make sure that when you're doing the activity, find a topic that you really, really like. Find something that you are very passionate about. Write a short poem about it. Keep it lively. Keep it short. You can go long if you want to. Whatever you want. It's your own poem. Um, but it is something you should do. It is going to be done here in class, and that's the topic going to be Cummings. And I hope everyone enjoyed and learned something new today.